Before Jeanne became a martyr, she was a miracle France barely understood. Not long before her capture, the kingdom had been collapsing. Cities were lost. The crown was fragile. Then a peasant girl appeared with no rank, no army, no permission except her certainty. Against every rule of war, she lifted the siege of Orléans and walked Charles to his crown. France began to breathe again. And then she was left behind. This is where this story begins. Jeanne did not fall in a heroic last stand. There was no final charge, no desperate rescue, no royal command to shield her. She was captured in a quiet moment, at the edge of a war that had already moved on. The armies she inspired were marching forward. The king she crowned was securing his throne. Victory was becoming administration. Jeanne stood alone. Her capture did not shake the court. It was treated as an inconvenience, something to be handled later. No ransom was demanded in her name. No urgent attempt was made to bring her home. The girl who had carried the soul of France became a liability. This silence was not accidental, because Jeanne was never taken by chains alone. She was taken by absence. The absence of protection, the absence of loyalty, the absence of courage from those who now had power to lose. For the English and their allies, her capture was not the end of a threat. It was the beginning of an opportunity. Jeanne was not merely a soldier. She was a living contradiction to their authority, and contradictions must be erased carefully. So they chose not a blade, but a courtroom. What followed would not be a search for truth, but the methodical destruction of belief itself. And in trying to silence her, they would give France something it had never possessed before. A martyr whose fire could not be extinguished. If you want to follow how a young girl was broken in body, but forged into history itself, stay with this story. And if these forgotten moments of power, betrayal, and human cost matter to you, subscribe to the channel and walk with us through the shadows of history. The courtroom was prepared long before Jeanne entered it. Stone walls closed in like a verdict already spoken. The judges were robed as servants of God, but their loyalties were political and precise. This was not a place built to discover truth. It was a mechanism designed to cleanse a killing and call it justice. Jeanne stood alone before men who had already decided what she was. Not a soldier, not a messenger, not a daughter of France. She was labeled a problem that needed resolution. The questions began softly. They asked about faith, about obedience, about whether she submitted herself fully to the authority of the church. Each question seemed simple on the surface, yet carried hidden blades. A wrong word could condemn her as a heretic. A cautious answer could be twisted into guilt. Jeanne listened, then she answered. She did not speak like a theologian. She spoke like someone who had lived with certainty. When asked if her voices came from God, she refused the trap of false humility. She said she trusted what she had heard. When pressed to deny them, she replied that she would not lie to save her life. The judges grew uneasy. They shifted the ground beneath her feet. They questioned her clothing, her armor, her refusal to dress as a woman in captivity. They framed her identity itself as a crime. To them, the body she wore was evidence of rebellion. Jeanne did not flinch. She answered with clarity, not defiance. She explained necessity where they demanded confession. She spoke of survival where they demanded submission. Every response dismantled their traps without naming them. This was not ignorance meeting knowledge. It was instinct confronting doctrine. The clerics grew sharper, the hours longer. They isolated her, denied her counsel, threatened her with torture she could hear being prepared nearby. The The courtroom became a theater of pressure where exhaustion was the final weapon. Still, she held. Her strength did not come from shouting or prophecy. It came from coherence. She knew who she was. And because of that, their contradictions became visible. Each attempt to corner her revealed the court itself was afraid. Not of her body, of her meaning. A girl who answered kings and soldiers without trembling now stood before scholars and bishops and refused to collapse into the role they wrote for her. The trial was meant to erase the myth of Jeanne. Instead, it sharpened it. The judges recorded every word carefully, not to preserve truth, but to edit it later, to shape a narrative where obedience mattered more than courage and order mattered more than justice. The verdict had never been in doubt. Yet with every question and every answer, something irreversible was happening. The court believed it was dismantling a symbol. In reality, it was building one. And when the trial finally moved toward its conclusion, it was no longer about whether Jeanne would live. It was about whether France would remember what had been done in the name of God and power. The verdict was delivered without trembling. Death by fire for heresy. The words were legal. The tone was cold. The outcome had been decided long before Jeanne entered the courtroom. But far from Rouen, behind stone walls and guarded halls, another silence was taking shape. Charles VII knew. He knew the girl who had lifted the siege of Orléans. He knew the voice that had walked beside his banner when France still believed it was dying. He knew the hands that held the white standard when he was crowned at Reims. And yet he did nothing. Politics spoke louder than gratitude. Burgundy watched closely. England waited. A rescued Jeanne would reopen war at a moment when Charles wanted stability. To save her would be to risk everything she had already won for him. So the king remained still. Jeanne was led through the streets of Rouen as dawn broke. The city that once whispered her name now observed in silence. Faces pressed against windows. Soldiers stood rigid. No cheers, no hatred, only unease. The stake stood ready. She was dressed in white, bound carefully, methodically. This was not rage. It was procedure, the kind that hides fear behind ritual. A priest raised a cross. Jeanne asked that it be lifted higher. She wanted to see it above the fire. One last chance was offered to recant. One word could have saved her life. She refused. Not with defiance, with certainty. When the flames rose, there was no miracle, no rescue. No royal banner appeared on the horizon. The crown she had restored did not move. Her voice was heard once, then the smoke swallowed everything. In that moment, something irreversible happened. The girl died, the king survived, and history judged them both. The crowd did not celebrate. Some wept, others stared in horror. Even the executioners turned away. The fire did its work, but it revealed more than it destroyed. Ashes were thrown into the river to erase all trace. No grave, no relic, no place of return. But erasure failed, because Jeanne did not belong to the fire anymore. She belonged to memory. Across France, people spoke her name with anger, not at England, but at silence. A question spread quietly through villages and courts. What kind of kingdom allows its savior to burn? Charles VII would wear his crown for many years. He would reclaim lands. He would strengthen France. But the shadow of Rouen never left him. Jeanne had given him legitimacy. Her death exposed its cost. The English believed they had destroyed a symbol. The king believed he had avoided a war. Both were wrong. Because from the ashes of one unprotected girl, something far more dangerous was born. A martyr who could no longer be controlled. The news did not travel like a trumpet call. There were no proclamations, no banners, no official mourning. It moved quietly. From mouth to mouth, from chapel to field, from soldier to widow. They burned her, not in anger, not in fear, but in betrayal. At first there was disbelief. Many refused to accept it. Some said it was a lie spread by the English. Others believed a miracle must have happened at the last moment, that God would not allow such an ending. But the truth settled in slowly, and when it did not bring panic. It brought something far more dangerous: resolve. Jeanne became more powerful in death than she had ever been in armor, because now she belonged to no faction, no court, no command. She belonged to everyone. In villages where taxes had crushed hope for decades, people began to speak her name not as a saint, but as proof. Proof that France was worth suffering for. Proof that injustice could no longer be ignored. Soldiers who once fought for pay now fought for memory. They tied scraps of white cloth to their weapons, not as a uniform, as a reminder. This is for her. Even among the nobility, something shifted. Men who had dismissed Jeanne as a useful illusion now understood the cost of that dismissal. Her execution exposed a truth they could no longer hide behind diplomacy. France had survived not because of kings, but because of belief. The English failed to see it. They believed fear would break resistance, that fire would erase legend. Instead, they created a mirror that reflected their own cruelty back at them. Wherever English banners flew, whispers followed. This is what they did to her. And the war changed shape. It became quieter, more patient, less theatrical. French commanders avoided grand declarations. They chose endurance, siege by siege, road by road, town by town. Each victory was small, almost unremarkable. Together they became unstoppable. Charles VII watched this transformation from his court. He did not lead it. He did not ignite it. But he learned to follow it. Slowly, he allowed the story to change. Jeanne was no longer spoken of as a dangerous fanatic. She became a martyr of France. Her name was allowed back into prayer. Her image quietly returned to banners. Not as a commander, as a conscience. The people did not ask for miracles anymore. They asked for justice, and justice moved with terrifying persistence. A nation once fractured by betrayal began to align around a shared wound. That wound gave them identity. We fight because she was silenced. We endure because she did not break. We advance because her voice was taken. From the ashes of Rouen, a new France began to take shape. Not triumphant, not merciful, but awake. And once awakened, it would not return to sleep. What followed Jeanne's death was not an immediate uprising or a wave of emotion. It was something colder and more dangerous: resolution. For years after her execution, the war entered a quieter phase. No miracles, no banners carried by prophecy, only systems slowly changing beneath the surface of the French state. Charles VII understood something his predecessors had not. France could no longer rely on inspired moments or feudal loyalty. It needed permanence. The first change was military. For the first time, the crown began to maintain a standing army. Soldiers were paid directly by the royal treasury, instead of serving only when summoned by local lords. Discipline replaced chaos. Orders began to matter more than lineage. Artillery followed. French cannons improved rapidly both in number and coordination. Castles that once took years to break now fell in weeks. English strongholds that relied on medieval defenses discovered they belonged to an older age. The second change was political. Charles VII weakened the power of rival nobles who had once treated the kingdom as a shared possession. Authority moved inward toward the crown. Taxation became centralized. Rebellion became more costly. England felt this shift but could not match it. The war drained resources at home. Distance stretched supply lines thin. Each lost town demanded men and gold. England could no longer spare. Victory no longer came from glorious charges, but from attrition, from knowing where to strike and when to wait. By the 1440s, the balance had fully turned. Normandy collapsed. Gascony followed. English rule retreated not with a final battle, but with a long retreat across the Channel. By the end, only Calais remained. Jeanne was gone, but the world she forced into motion had matured without her. France emerged not redeemed, but rebuilt, harder, more centralized, more aware of its own identity. England lost more than territory. It lost its future on the continent. The war that began as a dispute between dynasties ended as the birth of two separate nations. And history would remember that the turning point was not a treaty or a king. It was a young woman whose death forced a kingdom to finally grow up. When the fire at Rouen fades from the memory of the battlefield, something colder begins inside the Valois court. Silence. Charles VII does not speak publicly of Jeanne. He does not challenge her sentence. He does not declare vengeance. But inside the machinery of the kingdom, decisions begin to change. For the first time in decades, the Valois crown stops behaving like a claimant and starts acting like a state. The lesson is brutal and undeniable. Faith can ignite men, but only structure can win wars. In the years following Jeanne's death, Charles VII moves with calculated patience. He breaks the old dependence on feudal levies that had doomed French armies at Crécy and Poitiers. He builds a permanent royal army loyal to the crown rather than to individual lords. He reorganizes taxation to fund soldiers who are trained, paid, and disciplined. This is not the France Jeanne imagined, but it is the France her sacrifice made possible. The English begin to lose ground, not in a single dramatic collapse, but through steady pressure. Garrisons are isolated, supply lines are cut. Local nobles once loyal to England reconsider their position. Burgundy drifts away as the balance of power shifts. The war becomes administrative before it becomes decisive. The Valois monarchy evolves. It no longer relies on miracle or charisma. It relies on institutions. By the time the English realize the change, it is too late. Their victories belong to an older war. The Valois are fighting a new one. Jeanne is not invoked in proclamations. Her name is rarely spoken in councils. Yet her absence shapes every decision. The crown understands now the cost of hesitation. It understands what happens when legitimacy is borrowed instead of secured. England still holds territory, battles still loom, but the direction of history has turned quietly and irreversibly. The Valois Dynasty no longer survives from year to year. It begins to plan decades ahead. As the image fades, we do not return to the flames. We move forward. Maps change, borders tighten. The crown grows heavier but steadier. Jeanne does not appear again in this story, and that is precisely the point. She was never meant to rule. She was meant to force a choice. And the Valois chose survival. In the next episode, we will follow how this rebuilt crown pushes the English to the edge of the continent, and how victory itself plants the seeds of new internal conflict. If you want to continue this journey through the rise, survival, and inner fractures of the Valois dynasty, follow the channel. Subscribe. The war is not over yet.